I started smelling blood long before I understood what it meant. And maybe that's why today I have no doubt about what happened to me, or what happened to my family after that night I killed the alpha, the werewolf that led the pack roaming those mountains between Montana and Alberta. What I'm about to tell you will make you question everything you thought you knew about what's really hunting in our forests. This is the true story of the night I discovered that monsters are real, and they want more than just to kill you. They want to make you one of them. Subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and tell me where you're watching this story from. I've lived in these mountains long enough to know when something's wrong with the forest. Really wrong. Not the kind of wrong that comes with a bad storm rolling in, or even the tense quiet before a wildfire. This was different. This was the kind of silence that makes your skin crawl and your gut twist, the kind that tells you something has fundamentally shifted in the natural order of things. My name is Marcus, and I've been taking care of the old family cabin near Glacier National Park for the better part of 5 years now. Dad left it to me when he passed, along with the responsibility of maintaining the property and keeping an eye on the surrounding wilderness. It's isolated work, but I've never minded the solitude. At least I never minded it until that autumn when everything changed. The first sign came in late October when I realized I hadn't seen a single deer in over a week. That might not sound like much to city folks, but out here deer are everywhere. They graze in the meadows at dawn, drink from the stream that runs behind the cabin, and leave their tracks all over the muddy paths that crisscross the property. They're part of the daily rhythm of life in these mountains. But suddenly, they were gone. All of them. I told myself it was just migration patterns shifting, maybe the herds moving to better grazing grounds or avoiding some new predator in the area. Bears sometimes drive deer away from their usual haunts, and mountain lions can clear out a territory pretty effectively. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized this wasn't normal predator activity. This was something else entirely. The silence was what really got to me. You know how a forest should sound, right? Wind rustling through pine needles, small animals scurrying through the underbrush, birds calling to each other across the canopy. Even on calm days, there's always some kind of ambient noise, some sign that the ecosystem is alive and functioning. But for 3 straight days, I heard nothing. Absolutely nothing. Have you ever been in a place where even the wind seems afraid to make a sound, where the air itself feels like it's waiting for something terrible to happen? That's what surrounded my cabin during those first few days. It was like the entire forest was holding its breath. On the 4th day, I started feeling vibrations in the ground, not earthquakes, nothing that dramatic. These were rhythmic, deliberate vibrations that seemed to come from something moving through the trees around my property. Something big, something that was walking in a pattern I couldn't quite identify. At first, I thought it might be a large bear. We get brown bears through here sometimes, especially in late fall when they're bulking up for winter. But bears move in a steady 4-legged rhythm. These vibrations were different. They were irregular, almost hesitant, like whatever was making them couldn't decide whether it wanted to walk on 2 legs or 4. That's when I knew something was hunting in my forest. Something that didn't belong. I've always been a light sleeper, which comes in handy when you're living alone in the wilderness. Every sound registers. Every shift in the normal nighttime rhythm gets filed away in the back of your mind for evaluation. So when I started hearing movement around the cabin after midnight, I paid attention. The first few nights it was subtle. Footsteps, if you could call them that, circling the property in wide loops. Whatever was out there seemed to be mapping the area, learning the layout, understanding the territory. It would approach from different directions each night, never following the same path twice. I started doing armed patrols around the cabin with my father's old Winchester. Dad had taught me to shoot when I was 12, and I'd kept up with target practice over the years. I'm not military or law enforcement, but I can hit what I'm aiming at when it matters. Still, walking through those dark woods with nothing but a flashlight and a rifle, listening for something that might or might not be there, tested every nerve I had. On the 6th night, I found the first tracks. They were near the stream, pressed deep into the muddy bank where something had come down to drink. At first glance, they looked like wolf prints, large wolf prints, bigger than any I'd ever seen, but recognizably canine in their basic shape. Except for one thing, the weight distribution was all wrong. Wolf tracks show pad and claw marks with the weight evenly distributed across the paw. These tracks had the right shape, but the pressure points were different. The back of each print was deeper than the front, as if whatever made them was putting most of its weight on what would be the heel. Like it was walking upright and coming down on the back of its feet. I photographed them with my phone, took measurements, even made a plaster cast of the clearest print. The track was nearly 6 inches long and 4 inches wide. The stride length between prints suggested something at least 8 feet tall when standing upright. But what really made my hands shake was the depth of the impressions. Whatever made these tracks had to weigh at least 300 pounds. The next morning, I found more evidence. Claw marks on the trees surrounding the stream, carved deep into the bark about 9 feet off the ground. 4 parallel lines, each groove as thick as my thumb, and running down the trunk in perfectly straight lines. The marks were fresh, sap still weeping from the wounds in the wood. I've seen bear claw marks before. Bears will mark territory by scratching trees, but they do it while standing on their hind legs, which puts their reach at maybe 7 feet maximum for a large brown bear. And bear claws make wider, less precise marks. These were different. These were made by something taller, something with longer claws, something that had more control over its movements. My dog Daisy had been acting strange all week, but that night she completely lost it. Daisy's a mix, part German Shepherd, part Labrador, and she's normally fearless. She'll chase bears away from the garbage and bark down mountain lions without hesitation, but when we were doing our evening patrol and she caught sight of the tree line, she just froze. I've never seen an animal reaction quite like it. She didn't growl or bark or show any sign of aggression. She just stood there in the middle of the yard, her whole body trembling, staring at the forest with her tail tucked between her legs. And then she urinated right where she stood, which Daisy had never done before in her life. She was terrified. Not cautious or alert or even frightened, absolutely, completely terrified of something she could sense but I couldn't see. That's when I heard it for the first time. The breathing. It came from somewhere above us up in the canopy, but it was too loud and too deep for any bird or small mammal. It sounded like something with a massive chest cavity, drawing breath slowly and deliberately. Each inhalation seemed to pull the air out of the entire night, and each exhalation came with a low rumble that I felt in my ribcage. I pointed my flashlight toward the sound, hands shaking, and that's when I saw them. The claw marks weren't just on one tree, they were on dozens of trees, all at the same impossible height, all showing the same 4 parallel gouges descending toward the ground. Something had been climbing these trees, something with claws like knives and the ability to move through the forest canopy without making a sound. Something that was watching us right now. Sleep became impossible after that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard that breathing sound echoing in my head. Deep, measured, deliberate. It wasn't the rapid panting of an animal in distress, or the irregular breathing of something injured. This was controlled, intelligent breathing. The breathing of something that was thinking while it watched. I started sleeping in 2-hour shifts, setting my alarm to wake me for patrol rounds throughout the night. Daisy refused to come outside after sunset, which left me doing these rounds alone. She'd position herself by the front door and whine whenever I prepared to go out, but nothing I did could coax her past the threshold once darkness fell. The breathing continued for 3 more nights, always from a different location, always from above. Sometimes it came from the old growth pines on the north side of the property, sometimes from the cluster of firs near the stream. But it was always too high up, always in places where normal animals couldn't reach. On the 3rd night, I decided to investigate more thoroughly. I'd been a rock climber in college, and I still had most of my gear stored in the cabin's basement. If something was moving through the treetops, I was going to find out what. I chose the largest pine on the north side, a massive tree that had to be at least 100 years old. Its trunk was easily 4 feet in diameter, and its lowest branches started about 15 feet off the ground. Perfect for something that wanted to observe the cabin while staying hidden. The climb was harder than I remembered. 5 years of cabin maintenance had kept me in decent shape, but technical climbing uses different muscle groups. By the time I reached the first major branch, my shoulders were burning and my hands were cramping from gripping the rope. But what I found up there made every ache worth it. The branches showed signs of recent use. Heavy use. Bark had been scraped away in places where something large had moved from branch to branch. Some of the smaller limbs were bent or broken, snapped under weight they were never meant to support, and everywhere I looked, I found more of those claw marks. They weren't random scratches made by an animal trying to climb. These marks were deliberate, purposeful. Something had been using its claws to anchor itself while moving through the canopy, gripping branches with precision and control. The pattern suggested hands rather than paws, hands with impossibly long claws. But the most disturbing discovery was near the top of the tree where the branches grew thick enough to support a large body. Someone or something had been spending time up there. The bark was worn smooth in places where a heavy form had rested against the trunk. Broken twigs and crushed needles formed a rough nest about 8 feet long and 3 feet wide. From that height you could see everything. The entire cabin, the surrounding yard, the driveway where I parked my truck. Anyone positioned in that tree would have a perfect view of my daily routine. They'd know when I woke up, when I ate breakfast, when I did my maintenance work around the property. They'd know when I was most vulnerable. I was being watched, studied, hunted. The climb down was terrifying because I kept expecting to hear that breathing sound below me, to look down and see glowing eyes staring back up. But the forest remained silent, which was almost worse. At least when I could hear the breathing, I knew where the threat was coming from. That night, I didn't even try to sleep. I sat in my living room with the Winchester across my lap, watching the windows and listening for any sound that might indicate movement outside. Around 3 a.m., I heard something new. Footsteps on the roof. Not the light scrabbling of squirrels or the occasional thud of a pine cone falling. These were deliberate, heavy footsteps moving slowly across the cabin's metal roof. Whatever was up there had to weigh at least as much as a full-grown man, but it was moving with incredible care, placing each step precisely to minimize noise. The footsteps started at the back of the cabin and moved toward the front, following the roofline directly over where I was sitting. I could track their progress by the subtle creaking of the support, beams above my head. When they reached the front edge of the roof, they stopped. For 10 minutes I heard nothing. No movement, no breathing, no indication that anything was there. But I could feel it. Whatever was on my roof was looking down at the living room windows, trying to see inside, trying to spot me. Then came a new sound, scratching. Long, slow scratches being carved into the metal roofing right above my head. 4 parallel lines, just like the marks I'd found on the trees. It was leaving its signature, marking my home as part of its territory. The scratching stopped and the footsteps resumed, moving back toward the rear of the cabin. I heard a soft thud as something heavy dropped to the ground behind the building, then silence. I didn't move from that chair until sunrise. When I finally worked up the courage to go outside and check the roof, I found exactly what I expected. 4 deep gouges in the metal, scraped through the protective coating down to the bare steel underneath. Something with claws like razors had been standing directly above my head, marking its territory and letting me know that nowhere was safe. The hunt was about to begin. 2 days passed without incident, which somehow made everything worse. The forest remained unnaturally silent, but now I knew something was actively hunting in my territory. Every shadow could hide a threat. Every sound, or lack of sound, carried potential danger. Daisy refused to eat and spent most of her time pressed against the inside of the front door, whining softly and occasionally letting out these broken little whimpers that broke my heart. I'd been sleeping maybe 2 hours a night, surviving on coffee and adrenaline. My hands shook constantly now, and I'd started seeing movement in my peripheral vision that turned out to be nothing when I looked directly. The isolation was getting to me, but calling for help felt impossible. What was I supposed to tell the sheriff? That something was breathing in my trees and walking on my roof? That I'd found claw marks too high for any normal animal? On the evening of October 30th, everything changed. I was doing my usual evening patrol around the property, Winchester loaded and ready, flashlight cutting through the darkness between the trees. The plan was simple: circle the cabin, check for new tracks or claw marks, then get back inside and wait for dawn. I'd been following the same route for over a week, and nothing had happened during these patrols. But this time, when I rounded the corner toward the storage shed, I heard Daisy. She was making sounds I'd never heard before. Not quite barking, not quite howling, but something in between that spoke of absolute terror and desperate pain. The sounds were coming from behind the shed, an area I couldn't see from where I was standing. I ran toward the noise, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly as I stumbled over uneven ground. The sounds were getting weaker, more pathetic, like Daisy was running out of strength to make them. By the time I reached the corner of the shed and could see what was happening, those brave little whimpers had almost stopped completely. What I saw in my flashlight beam will haunt me for the rest of my life. Something was crouched over Daisy's body, holding her with hands that were too large, too long, covered in dark fur, but shaped like human hands. Fingers, not paws, but actual fingers with joints and opposable thumbs, each one ending in a curved claw that gleamed black in the light. The creature was massive, easily 7 feet tall even in its crouched position. Its shoulders were broader than any human's, covered in thick, dark fur that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. But it was the hands that convinced me this wasn't any normal animal. Those hands showed intelligence, purpose, control. They were holding Daisy carefully, precisely, like tools designed for a specific task. When my light hit them, the creature slowly raised its head to look at me. I'll never forget those eyes. They weren't the flat, predatory eyes of a wild animal. They were amber-colored, almost golden, and they burned with an intelligence that was terrifyingly familiar. Human intelligence. The eyes of something that understood exactly what it was doing and why. The creature didn't flee when it saw me. It didn't even seem surprised. It just watched me, those amber eyes studying my face, my posture, my weapon. It was evaluating me, deciding whether I was a threat worth worrying about. Then it opened its mouth. Daisy had been torn open from her chest to her belly. The wound was precise, surgical, like something had used those clawed fingers to unzip her with deliberate care. There was surprisingly little blood on the ground, which suggested the killing had been quick and efficient, professional, but the creature wasn't eating her. It was displaying her. It had arranged her body so I could see exactly what it had done, positioned her wounds toward the light so there would be no doubt about its capabilities. This wasn't random predation. This was a message. The creature's mouth was wrong in ways that made my brain struggle to process what I was seeing. Too large, filled, with teeth that belonged on something much bigger than a wolf. When it opened wider, showing me more of those teeth, I realized it was smiling, actually smiling, the way a human might smile when they want to show you something they're proud of. It wanted me to see what it had done to my dog. It wanted me to understand that this was just the beginning. I don't remember deciding to shoot. My body made that choice without consulting my conscious mind. The Winchester barked once, the recoil slamming into my shoulder, and I saw the creature jerk backward, as the slug caught it high in the chest. It didn't fall. It stumbled, dropped Daisy's body, and let out a sound that was part roar, part scream, and part something else, something that almost sounded like words, like it was trying to say something in a language that its throat wasn't designed to speak. I fired again, aiming for center mass, and this shot took it in the neck. Dark blood, almost black in the flashlight beam, sprayed across the side of the shed. The creature tried to take a step toward me, those amber eyes blazing with rage and something that looked like surprise, but its own weight was working against it now. It collapsed beside Daisy's body, that massive chest heaving as it tried to breathe around the damage to its throat. Each breath produced a wet, rattling sound that echoed off the shed walls. Blood was pooling underneath it, spreading across the ground in a dark puddle. I stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, watching it die. Listening to those awful wet breaths get weaker and more irregular, and through it all those amber eyes never left my face. Even as the life went out of them, they stayed focused on me with an intensity that felt personal. When the breathing finally stopped, the forest seemed to exhale. The oppressive silence that had dominated the area for weeks was broken by normal night sounds, insects, small animals moving through the underbrush, wind in the trees. It was like nature itself had been holding its breath while this thing was alive. I'd killed it. Whatever it was, wherever it had come from, it was dead. But looking down at that massive, impossible body, I realized I'd made a terrible mistake. This wasn't just some rogue predator. This was something that belonged to a larger group, a pack, a family, and I'd just declared war on all of them. The adrenaline crash hit me about an hour later, leaving me shaking so badly I could barely hold my flashlight steady. I dragged the creature's body into the storage shed and covered it with a tarp. But I couldn't stop thinking about those amber eyes and the way it had smiled when it showed me what it had done to Daisy. I needed to document everything. Take photographs, measurements, gather evidence. If I was going to convince anyone that this had actually happened, I'd need proof. More than that, I needed to understand what I'd killed. The body was even more disturbing under the harsh light of my camping lantern. In death, the creature looked somehow both more and less human than it had when it was alive. The intelligence was gone from its eyes, leaving them flat and yellow, like those of any dead animal. But the physical contradictions were impossible to ignore. It had hands, not paws, not some intermediate evolutionary step between human and animal, but actual hands, with opposable thumbs and articulated fingers. The palms were covered in thick, calloused skin, but the back showed that coarse, dark fur I'd noticed before. Each finger ended in a claw that curved downward like a sickle, sharp enough to slice through leather. Its feet were the same disturbing mixture of human and animal characteristics. The basic structure was human: heel, arch, 5 toes, but enlarged and elongated to accommodate massive muscle groups. The toes ended in claws like the fingers, and thick pads covered the soles like the feet of something designed for silent movement across rough terrain. The head was where the nightmare truly lived. The skull was elongated, stretched forward into something that wasn't quite a snout, but wasn't human either. The jaw was packed with teeth, not just canines, but rows of sharp, tearing teeth designed for ripping flesh from bone. Yet the eyes were positioned like a human's, forward-facing, stereoscopic, the eyes of a hunter that relied on intelligence rather than just instinct. When I tried to take measurements, I discovered something that made my hands shake even worse. The creature was wearing clothing, not human clothing, but items that had clearly been modified to fit its unusual proportions. Crude pants made from what looked like animal hide, held up with a rope belt, a vest of the same material, designed to accommodate those massive shoulders. This thing had been intelligent enough to make clothing. It understood the concept of modesty or protection or temperature control. It was more than an animal, more than just a predator. It was something that thought and planned and understood its place in the world. I was photographing the claws when I heard the sound outside. It started as a low rumble, barely audible, like distant thunder. But it grew stronger, closer, until I recognized it for what it was. Voices, multiple voices, calling to each other across the forest in a language that mixed human speech patterns with sounds no human throat could make. They were looking for their missing member. The pack had come to find out what happened to the creature I'd killed. I turned off the lantern immediately, plunging the shed into darkness. Through the small window, I could see movement in the tree line. Large shapes passing between the trunks, sometimes upright, sometimes on all fours. The calling continued, growing more urgent and angry as they picked up the scent of blood. This was exactly what I'd feared. The creature I'd killed hadn't been alone. It had family, pack members, a social structure I'd just disrupted with 2 rifle shots. And now they were here to collect their dead and settle the score. I counted at least 6 different voices, maybe more. The sounds they made weren't quite human speech and weren't quite animal calls, but something that fell uncomfortably between the two. There were questioning tones, answers, what sounded like commands or directions. They were coordinating, organizing, planning. The calling stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence even more oppressive than the one that had dominated my property for weeks. They'd found something, tracks, scent, blood trail, that told them where to look. Heavy footsteps approached the shed, multiple sets of footsteps, moving with the same careful precision I'd noticed during the roof incident. Whatever these creatures were, they understood stealth and coordination. They knew how to hunt as a team. Something tested the shed door, pushing against it gently. The lock held, but I could hear breathing on the other side of the wall. That same deep, Controlled breathing I'd been hearing in the trees. They knew their pack member was inside. They could smell the blood, probably smell me as well. More testing of potential entry points. Windows, walls, even the roof as something large moved across it with careful steps. They were mapping the structure, looking for weaknesses, planning their approach, just like their dead pack member had done with my cabin. Then came a sound that nearly made me scream. Scratching. Long, deliberate scratches being carved into the wooden door, right at eye level. 4 parallel lines, the same signature I'd been seeing on trees and rooftops for weeks. But this time, there were multiple sets of claws working together, creating a pattern too complex for any single creature. They were leaving a message. Not for me. They knew I was inside, but for whatever came after. Evidence that they'd been here, that they'd found their dead pack member, that they knew who was responsible. The scratching stopped, and the footsteps moved away from the shed. But I could still hear them out there, circling, discussing, planning. The conversation went on for almost an hour, those impossible hybrid voices rising and falling, in tones that spoke of anger and grief and terrible purpose. When the sounds finally faded into the distance, I waited another 2 hours before emerging from the shed. The forest had returned to its unnatural silence, but now I understood what that silence meant. They were still out there, still watching, but they'd learned everything they needed to know. I went back into the shed to check on the body, and my blood turned to ice water in my veins. The creature was gone. The tarp lay empty on the floor, stained with blood but no longer covering anything. The door was still locked from the inside. The windows were too small for something that large to fit through, but somehow, impossibly, the body had vanished. Had they taken it? Had they found a way inside that I'd missed? Or had something even worse happened? Had the thing I shot gotten up and walked away on its own? I spent the rest of that night searching every inch of the shed, looking for some explanation of how a 300-pound body had disappeared from a locked room. The blood was still there, dark stains on the wooden floor that proved I hadn't imagined the whole thing. The smell lingered too, that mixture of wet fur, musk and raw meat that had filled my nostrils when I'd first encountered the creature. But the body was gone. The door showed fresh damage around the lock mechanism. Not damage from the outside, as if someone had broken in, but from the inside, as if something had torn its way out. The metal was twisted and bent, and there were claw marks in the wood around the lock that matched the pattern I'd been seeing everywhere else. That should have been impossible. I'd watched the thing die. I'd seen the light go out of those amber eyes. I'd waited until the breathing stopped completely before approaching the body. Nothing survives 2 rifle shots to the chest and throat, especially not something that bleeds as heavily as this creature had, unless it wasn't entirely natural to begin with. The thought had been lurking in the back of my mind since that first night when I'd heard breathing in the trees. Normal animals don't climb like that. Normal animals don't use tools or wear clothing or coordinate hunting strategies with that level of sophistication. And normal animals definitely don't come back from the dead. I was dealing with something beyond the usual rules of biology and physics. Something that operated according to different laws, older laws that predated human understanding of how the world worked. By the time dawn broke, I'd made a decision. I needed help, and I needed to get away from the cabin before the pack came back. Whatever I'd stumbled into was bigger than anything I could handle alone. It was time to contact my family, tell them what was happening, and figure out a plan for dealing with these creatures. My parents lived about 40 minutes away, down the mountain in a small town called Cedar Falls. My sister Emma lived with them, working remote for a tech company in Seattle while she saved money for her own place. If anyone would believe my story, it would be them. They knew these mountains, knew the kinds of wildlife that belonged here and the kinds that didn't. I packed essentials into my truck, clothes, ammunition, the photographs I'd taken of the tracks and claw marks, everything that might serve as evidence. Daisy's body was gone too, I realized as I was loading my gear. Sometime during the night, while I was trapped in the shed, something had removed her from where she'd died. The drive down the mountain should have been a relief, putting distance between myself and whatever was hunting in those woods. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. Movement in the trees paralleling the road, shadows that didn't match the morning light, brief glimpses of something large keeping pace with my truck. They were tracking me. The pack was making sure I understood that killing one of their members had consequences that extended beyond my property. Wherever I went, they would find me. My parents' house sat on a quiet street lined with modest homes and old-growth maple trees. Dad was a retired forest ranger, which was how he'd ended up with the mountain cabin in the first place. Mom taught elementary school and had lived in Cedar Falls her entire life. They were practical, grounded people who understood the difference between normal wilderness dangers and something genuinely threatening. I knocked on their front door, rehearsing how I was going to explain what had happened. The story sounded insane, even in my own head. Giant humanoid creatures with claws and amber eyes, coordinated pack hunting, bodies that disappeared from locked rooms. They were going to think the isolation had finally gotten to me. No one answered the door. That was unusual. Mom was always up early, making coffee and checking her email before school. Dad usually spent his mornings reading the newspaper on the front porch. Even if they were still sleeping, they should have heard me knocking. I tried calling their phones. Both calls went straight to voicemail. The house felt wrong in a way I couldn't immediately identify. All the lights were off, which wasn't necessarily unusual for a weekday morning. The curtains were drawn, which was. Mom always opened the curtains first thing when she woke up. She said it helped her feel connected to the day. I used my spare key to let myself in, calling their names as I walked through the front hall. The silence that greeted me was the same oppressive quiet that had dominated my mountain property for weeks, the kind of silence that suggested something was fundamentally missing from the environment. The living room was empty but undisturbed. Same with the kitchen, though I noticed Mom's coffee maker was still full of yesterday's brew, now cold and bitter-smelling. That was completely out of character. Mom never went to bed without cleaning the coffee maker and setting it up for the next morning. I found them in the dining room. At least I found where they'd been. 3 place settings on the table, plates still full of what had been a warm dinner. Pot roast, mashed potatoes, green beans, Mom's standard Tuesday night meal. The food was cold now, but not moldy or spoiled. This had happened recently, maybe the night before. All 3 chairs were overturned, as if everyone had stood up quickly and simultaneously. Emma's purse was still hanging on the back of her chair, her phone plugged into the charger on the kitchen counter. Dad's reading glasses were on the table next to his plate, folded carefully beside his napkin. They'd been interrupted in the middle of dinner. Something had made them leave the table so quickly they hadn't even thought to grab personal items or finish eating. The back door was standing wide open. I approached it carefully, my hand on the pistol I'd brought as backup to the Winchester. The backyard was a mess of churned earth and broken landscaping. Mom's flower beds had been trampled by something heavy, moving through them at speed. And in the soft earth near the porch, I found what I was looking for. Tracks. The same impossible hybrid tracks I'd been finding around my cabin for weeks, but this time there were dozens of them. Large primary prints surrounded by smaller secondary ones, all pressed deep into the soil. The pack had been here, moving as a coordinated unit surrounding the house, and then, I followed the trail to the edge of the yard, where it disappeared into the tree line behind the property, but not before I found something that made my blood run cold. Drops of blood scattered across the grass. Not a lot, just a few dark spots here and there, as if someone had been bleeding from minor wounds. The kind of blood you might leave if you were dragged away quickly, before you could put up any serious resistance. My family was gone, taken by the same pack of creatures I'd been dealing with at the cabin. Taken because I'd killed their pack member, and they wanted revenge. This wasn't random predation. This was retaliation, and it was just the beginning. I called the police from my parents' kitchen, standing next to the cold pot roast and trying to explain why 3 adults had vanished from their own home without any sign of struggle inside the house. Deputy Sheriff Martinez arrived within 20 minutes, followed by Sheriff Coleman and a detective from the county. They were professional, thorough, and completely unprepared for what I had to tell them. "So you're saying they just disappeared from the dinner table?" Detective Barnes asked, making notes in a small, "Ted, no signs of forced entry, no disturbance inside the house." "That's right. The back door was open when I arrived, and there are tracks in the yard. Large tracks, too big for any normal animal." Sheriff Coleman walked through the house with me, examining each room systematically. He was a big man with 30 years of law enforcement experience, and he carried himself with the kind of confidence that comes from seeing everything at least twice. But I could tell this situation was outside his normal parameters. "You say you're the son?" he asked, checking the family photos on the mantelpiece. "Marcus. I live in the old cabin up near Glacier Park. Been staying there about 5 years now." "And when did you last speak to your parents?" I had to think about that. With everything that had been happening at the cabin, I'd been focused on my own problems rather than maintaining regular contact. Maybe a week ago. Mom called to check on me, make sure I was doing okay with winter coming on. Any family disputes, financial problems, reasons someone might want to hurt your parents or sister? The questions were standard procedure, but they felt surreal. Under the circumstances, how was I supposed to explain that my family had been taken by creatures that shouldn't exist? That this was retaliation for killing something that wasn't entirely animal and wasn't entirely human? "Sheriff, you need to see the tracks in the backyard. This wasn't a human abduction." He followed me outside, and I showed him the clearest prints near the flower beds. In daylight, they were even more disturbing than they'd been the night before. The hybrid nature of the tracks was obvious: canine shape with human weight distribution, pressed deep into soil that should have been too hard for anything to leave such clear impressions. "These look like large dog prints," Deputy Martinez said, kneeling next to one of the tracks. "Dogs don't have heel strikes," I pointed out, "and look at the stride length. Whatever made these was at least 7 feet tall when walking upright." Sheriff Coleman crouched down next to his deputy, studying the tracks more carefully. I could see him processing the evidence, trying to fit it into some framework that made sense within his experience of normal criminal activity. "Could be someone wearing animal costumes," he said finally. "We've seen that before in kidnapping cases. Perpetrators trying to confuse the evidence, make it look like animal attacks." "What about the size and the depth of the prints? Heavy boots, maybe platform shoes. Someone who knew how to manipulate the evidence." I wanted to scream. The physical evidence was right there in front of them. Track patterns no human could make. Claw marks too precise for any normal animal. Blood spatter that told the story of a coordinated pack attack. But they were determined to fit everything into familiar categories, rather than consider that something genuinely unprecedented might be happening. "Sheriff, I need to tell you about what's been happening at my cabin. This might be connected to—" "Let's focus on the immediate situation," Detective Barnes interrupted. "We'll file a missing persons report and put out a BOLO alert. If your family was taken against their will, we'll find them. But right now we need to concentrate on evidence that can actually help with the investigation." They spent another hour photographing the scene and taking statements, but I could tell they'd already decided this was a human crime with a human solution. The unusual tracks were filed away as possible costume evidence, and the blood spatter was attributed to minor injuries during the struggle. When they finally left, I was alone in my parents' house with a cold dinner and the growing certainty that official help wasn't coming. The police were going to treat this as a kidnapping case, which meant they'd be looking for human perpetrators with human motives. They'd waste time investigating family finances and personal relationships, while my family was somewhere in the forest with creatures that operated according to entirely different rules. I sat at the dining table, looking at the 3 abandoned plates, and tried to piece together what had happened. The timing wasn't coincidental. I'd killed their pack member 2 nights ago, and my family had disappeared yesterday evening. The creatures had needed time to track down my relatives, plan their approach, coordinate the attack. This was sophisticated tactical thinking. They'd identified my vulnerable points and struck where I couldn't defend against them. They'd taken my family to demonstrate that my actions had consequences, extending far beyond my mountain cabin. But why take them alive? If this was simple revenge, they could have killed everyone and left the bodies as a message. Instead, they'd gone to the trouble of abducting 3 adults without leaving obvious signs of violence inside the house. That suggested they had plans that required living captives. The thought of what those plans might involve made me sick. I checked the rest of the house for any clues the police might have missed. In Emma's room, I found her laptop still open to the video call software she used for work. The call log showed her last session had ended abruptly at 7:23 p.m. the night before, right in the middle of what should have been a routine client meeting. Whatever had taken them had struck fast enough to interrupt dinner and a business call simultaneously. Professional coordination, perfect timing, overwhelming force applied with surgical precision. As I was preparing to leave, I noticed something else that made my hands start shaking again. Scratched into the paint beside the back door, at exactly the height I'd come to expect, were 4 parallel claw marks. Fresh marks, carved deep enough to show the wood underneath. They'd left their signature here too, not hidden or camouflaged, but right next to the door where anyone looking would see it immediately. The message was clear. We were here. We took what belonged to you and we'll be back whenever we want. I was dealing with intelligence that matched or exceeded human capabilities, combined with physical abilities that defied every rule of normal biology. And somewhere in the forest they had my family. The hunt had entered a new phase. The police investigation lasted 3 days and turned up exactly what I expected. Nothing. No human fingerprints, no DNA evidence that matched any known criminals, no leads from the blood samples or track impressions. Detective Barnes called to inform me they were expanding the search parameters and bringing in additional resources, but I could hear the frustration in his voice. They were dealing with something beyond their training and experience, but they couldn't admit that without abandoning everything they understood about how crimes worked. I spent those 3 days doing my own investigation. If the official search wasn't going to acknowledge what we were really dealing with, I'd have to find my family myself. That meant returning to the cabin and trying to understand more about the creatures that had taken them. The drive back up the mountain felt like entering enemy territory. Every shadow between, the trees might hide watchers. Every curve in the road might be an ambush point, but I needed answers, and the only place to find them was where this had all started. The cabin looked exactly as I'd left it, but the atmosphere around the property had changed again. The oppressive silence was gone, replaced by something that felt like anticipation. The forest was waiting for something to happen. I found the first new evidence in the storage shed, where I'd killed the creature. The claw marks on the door had been joined by others, carved at different heights and angles. Some were clearly made by the same type of claws I'd been seeing, but others were smaller, more delicate. They'd brought their young here, shown them where their pack member had died. This was becoming generational. Whatever blood debt I'd incurred wasn't going to die with the current pack. They were teaching their offspring to remember, to carry the grudge forward into whatever came next. But the most disturbing discovery was behind the shed, where I found what could only be described as a shrine. Someone had arranged stones in a careful circle about 6 feet in diameter. In the center of the circle, they'd placed items that obviously came from my family. Dad's reading glasses, Emma's phone, Mum's house keys. The objects were arranged with ritual precision, like offerings or totems in some ancient ceremony. Surrounding the central items were other things I didn't recognize immediately. Bones, but not from any animal I could identify. Carved stones with symbols that looked almost like writing, but weren't from any alphabet I'd ever seen. Small wooden figurines that might have been crude representations of human forms. This wasn't random predator behavior. This was religious or ceremonial activity, the kind of complex symbolic thinking that required abstract reasoning and cultural traditions passed down through generations. I photographed everything before disturbing the shrine, though I knew no one would believe what the pictures showed. Then I carefully collected my family's belongings, hoping they might retain some scent that could help me track where my relatives had been taken. The trail leading away from the shrine was easier to follow than I'd expected. Either the creatures didn't care if I followed them, or they wanted me to find their base of operations. The tracks led deeper into the forest, toward an area of old-growth timber that I'd never explored thoroughly. As I followed the trail, I began noticing other signs of long-term habitation in the area. Trees with bark stripped away at specific heights, revealing pale wood underneath that had been carved with those same symbolic markings I'd found at the shrine. Clearings where the undergrowth had been systematically removed to create open spaces. Rock formations that had been modified into crude shelters or storage areas. They'd been living in this forest for years, maybe decades. This wasn't a recent intrusion into human territory. This was an established community with its own infrastructure and territorial boundaries. After about 2 miles, the trail led to a ravine I'd never seen before, hidden by dense tree cover and accessible only through a narrow passage between massive boulders. The tracks disappeared at the edge of the ravine, but I could hear sounds echoing from below, voices calling to each other in that hybrid language I'd heard the night they came looking for their dead pack member. I climbed down into the ravine carefully, using tree roots and rock outcroppings for handholds. The descent was about 30 feet, ending at the edge of what could only be described as a village. They'd built structures into the ravine walls using stones, wood, and what looked like some kind of natural cement. The buildings were crude but functional, designed to accommodate their unusual proportions. Larger doorways, reinforced floors, ceiling heights that would allow creatures over 7 feet tall to move around comfortably, and there were a lot of them. I counted at least 20 individuals moving around the settlement, maybe more in the structures I couldn't see clearly. Adults, juveniles, even what appeared to be elderly members of the community. This wasn't just a hunting pack, this was a complete society with multiple generations living together. The creatures moved between human and animal postures with fluid ease. Some walked upright like people, using their hands to manipulate tools or carry objects. Others dropped to all fours when they needed to move quickly or climb over obstacles. They seemed to choose their movement style based on what was most efficient for the task at hand. But what terrified me most was how organized they were. I could see guard positions established around the perimeter of the settlement, communication networks that allowed sentries to relay information across the entire ravine. Groups coordinating various tasks with military-like precision. These creatures had intelligence, technology, social structure, and tactical thinking that equaled or surpassed anything human civilization had developed. They just operated according to different priorities and different rules, and somewhere in that settlement, they had my family. I watched for over an hour, trying to map the layout and identify potential weaknesses, but as the sun began to set, I realized I was in terrible danger. Night was coming, and they'd already demonstrated that darkness was when they did their hunting. I climbed back out of the ravine and started the long hike back to my truck, knowing I discovered something that changed everything I thought I understood about the world. Humanity wasn't alone on this planet. We'd just never realized what else was sharing our forests. Sheriff Coleman listened to my report about the ravine settlement with the same professional courtesy he'd shown during the initial investigation. But I could see the skepticism growing in his eyes with every word I spoke. When I finished describing what I'd seen, he leaned back in his desk chair and studied me for a long moment. "Marcus, I'm going to be straight with you. You've been under tremendous stress since your family disappeared. Living alone, dealing with isolation, worrying about their safety, that can play tricks on your mind. I have photographs, evidence, track impressions, claw marks, the shrine they built. What you have are pictures of rocks arranged in a circle and some scratches on trees, nothing that proves the existence of, what are you calling them? Humanoid wolves." Detective Barnes had joined us for this meeting, and she'd been taking notes throughout my report. Now she looked up from her pad with the kind of expression I'd seen medical professionals use when they're about to deliver bad news. "We've had the track impressions analyzed by a forensic expert from the state. His conclusion is that they were made by someone wearing modified footwear, possibly with extensions to simulate larger stride length. The blood samples from your parents' house came back as deer blood, probably used to simulate an attack scene." Deer blood? I felt like I was losing my grip on reality. Why would someone use deer blood to fake a kidnapping? To throw off the investigation? Make us waste time looking for wild animals instead of focusing on human perpetrators? Sheriff Coleman pulled out a file folder and opened it on his desk. Inside were crime scene photographs, forensic reports, and what looked like a psychological evaluation form. "Marcus, we think someone has been terrorizing you for weeks, possibly months. Harassment designed to isolate you, make you paranoid, set you up for what happened to your family. The animal tracks, the sounds in the forest, the claw marks, all of it could have been manufactured by someone who knows these mountains well and understands how to manipulate evidence. You think this is all fake, that someone has been running around in a wolf costume, climbing trees, leaving tracks? We think someone wanted you to believe in monsters, so you wouldn't look for the real threat, and it worked. While you've been chasing shadows and taking pictures of scratched trees, whoever actually took your family has had 3 days to cover their tracks and move them somewhere we can't find them. The logic was almost convincing. Human criminals certainly had the intelligence and planning ability to orchestrate something this sophisticated. And it was true that I'd been so focused on the impossible nature of what I was seeing that I hadn't seriously considered more conventional explanations. But the logic fell apart when you looked at the physical evidence. No human could make those tracks, not even with modified footwear. No human could climb the way these creatures climbed or move through the forest canopy with that kind of stealth. And no human could coordinate the kind of pack-hunting behavior I'd witnessed. What about the settlement in the ravine? Are you going to investigate that? We sent a team out this morning. GPS coordinates you provided led to an area where someone had clearly been camping illegally. Old fire rings, some crude shelters, evidence of long-term habitation, but no people, human or otherwise. They moved when they realized I'd found them. Or whoever was using that area as a base of operations cleared out because they knew we'd be coming. Detective Barnes closed her notepad and looked at me with what might have been sympathy. Marcus, we understand you want to help find your family, but chasing conspiracy theories and monster stories isn't helping anyone. If you really want to assist with this investigation, think about people who might have grudges against your parents. Ex-students of your mother's. People your father might have cited for code violations during his ranger days. Real enemies with real motives. I left the sheriff's office feeling more isolated than I had since this whole thing started. The official investigation was going in exactly the wrong direction, treating the evidence as an elaborate deception, rather than proof of something genuinely anomalous. They were going to waste weeks looking for human criminals who didn't exist while my family remained captive to creatures that operated outside every assumption law enforcement was trained to make. But there was one piece of information they'd given me that actually helped. If the settlement had been abandoned when the police arrived, that meant the creatures were mobile, capable of relocating their entire community when threatened. They weren't tied to that specific location. And if they could move that quickly, it probably meant they had other settlements, other ravines and hidden valleys, where they'd established backup communities. They'd been living in these mountains long enough to develop extensive infrastructure and contingency plans. I needed to find their new location before the trail went completely cold, but I also needed to accept that I was going to be doing it alone without official support or backup. That night I went back to my cabin and started planning a search that would either rescue my family or get me killed trying. I cleaned my father's Winchester, inventoried my ammunition, and studied topographic maps of the area surrounding the abandoned settlement. If these creatures were as intelligent as they appeared to be, they'd choose their new location based on the same criteria that had made the ravine attractive: hidden access, defensible perimeter, water source, shelter from weather and observation. I identified 6 possible locations within a 20-mile radius that met those requirements. Tomorrow I'd start checking them systematically one by one until I found where they'd taken my family. The creatures had made this personal when they took my parents and sister. Now it was time to make it personal right back. I was going hunting. The search for the creature's new settlement took 5 days and nearly got me killed twice. The first 3 locations I checked showed no signs of recent activity, just empty valleys and unused cave systems that might have served as temporary shelters in the past. The 4th site was occupied, but by a family of black bears. That made it very clear I wasn't welcome in their territory. It was the 5th location that almost ended everything. I'd been approaching a network of caves on the north face of Eagle Ridge when I realized I was being followed. Not stalked, not hunted, just accompanied. Something was keeping pace with me about 50 yards off to my left, moving through the forest with the same careful stealth I'd learned to recognize. Instead of running or trying to evade, I stopped and called out to whatever was tracking me. I know you're there. I know what you are. I just want my family back. The forest went completely silent for about 30 seconds. Then I heard that familiar sound, breathing from somewhere above me, up in the tree canopy. But this time it was accompanied by others. multiple creatures positioned in the trees around my location, surrounding me with coordinated precision. A voice spoke from the trees, not quite human speech, but close enough to be understandable. You killed Alpha. The words were slow, labored, spoken by a throat that wasn't designed for human language, but the meaning was clear, and the intelligence behind them was unmistakable. He killed my dog, I defended myself. Alpha, not hunt, you Alpha, hunt food, you interfere. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. They were saying the creature I'd killed hadn't been hunting me at all. It had been hunting something else, deer probably, or some other prey animal, and I'd misinterpreted what I was seeing. Then why did he kill my dog? A different voice answered, this one from a different tree, confirming that multiple creatures were involved in this conversation. Dog, attack. Alpha, defend. You not understand. They were claiming self-defense. According to their version of events, Daisy had attacked their pack member, and he'd killed her to protect himself. Then I'd shot him for what they saw as a justified response to aggression. Where is my family? Family. Safe. Family. Payment. For Alpha. Payment? You take Alpha. We take family. Fair. Exchange. The logic was brutal but understandable from their perspective. I'd killed a member of their pack, so they'd taken members of mine. Eye for an eye, life for life. Except they'd kept my family alive for reasons I didn't want to think about too carefully. What do you want me to do? There was a long pause filled with sounds that might have been conversation in their own language. When the first voice spoke again, the words came more easily, as if the speaker was getting more comfortable with human speech. You come with us. You replace Alpha. Family. Go. Free. They wanted to trade. My life for my family's lives, but not just death. They wanted me to join their pack, to take the place of the Alpha I'd killed, to become like them. How does that work? Moon, change, you, pack, accepted you become Alpha. I understood what they were offering, and it made perfect sense from their perspective. They needed pack leadership, and I'd proven my strength by killing their previous Alpha. If I submitted to whatever process they used to transform humans into creatures like themselves, I could take his place and everyone would get what they wanted. Except I'd no longer be human. I need time to think about it. 3 days. Next. Full moon. You decide then. The breathing sounds moved away through the trees, heading deeper into the forest. But one voice called back to me as they departed. We watch you. Always watch. You run family. Dies. I made it back to my cabin as the sun was setting, my hands shaking so badly I could barely unlock the front door. The creatures had given me an ultimatum: join their pack willingly, or watch my family pay the price for my refusal. But they'd also given me information I could use. 3 days until the full moon meant 3 days to find their current location and attempt a rescue. They'd mentioned the moon's role in their transformation process, which suggested their abilities were tied to lunar cycles in ways I didn't understand. Most importantly, they'd confirmed my family was still alive, being held as leverage but alive. That night, the psychological warfare began in earnest. It started around midnight with sounds outside the cabin, not the breathing I'd grown accustomed to, but voices, human voices calling my name from different directions, sometimes sounding like my mother, sometimes like my father or Emma. Marcus, help us. Where are you, son? Please, Marcus, they're hurting us. The voices were perfect mimicry, exact reproductions of my family's speech patterns and vocal characteristics. If I hadn't known my family was being held captive, I would have sworn they were standing outside the cabin calling for help. But when I looked out the windows, I saw only darkness and the occasional glimpse of large shapes moving between the trees. The creatures were using their intelligence and vocal abilities to torment me, to wear down my resistance, and make me desperate enough to accept their offer. The calling continued for hours, sometimes pleading, sometimes screaming, always using the voices of people I loved. When dawn finally came, the sounds stopped, but the message was clear. This was what I'd hear every night until I made my decision. The next 2 nights were worse. The creatures added visual elements to their psychological assault, showing me glimpses of figures that looked like my family members stumbling through the forest, always just far enough away that I couldn't be sure what I was seeing. On the final night before the full moon, they escalated to physical evidence. I found items of my family's clothing scattered around the cabin property: Mom's sweater, Dad's jacket, Emma's scarf, all torn and blood-stained, positioned where I'd be sure to find them during my morning patrol. They were running out of patience, and they wanted me to understand that my family's condition would continue to deteriorate until I gave them what they wanted. As I sat in my cabin on the night before the full moon, listening to perfect reproductions of my family's voices begging for help outside my windows, I realized I was out of options. I couldn't find their settlement through conventional searching. The police weren't going to help with a situation they refused to acknowledge, and every day I delayed was another day my family spent as captives of creatures whose idea of negotiation involved psychological torture. Tomorrow night, when the moon was full, I was going to have to make a choice that would determine not just my fate, but the fate of everyone I cared about. The creatures wanted a new alpha for their pack. Maybe it was time to give them one. The morning of the full moon brought an unusual silence to the forest around my cabin. No bird songs, no insect buzzing, no wind moving through the trees. Even the normal creaking and settling sounds of the old building seemed muffled, as if the entire world was holding its breath while waiting for something momentous to happen. I'd made my decision during the sleepless hours before dawn, but I wasn't planning to announce it until I'd exhausted every other option. If the creatures expected me to surrender myself tonight, I had maybe 12 hours to find my family and attempt a rescue that would probably get us all killed. But I had one advantage they might not have considered. They'd been watching me for weeks, learning my patterns and routines, but they'd also been revealing their own behavioral patterns in the process. I knew how they moved, how they communicated, how they coordinated their activities. And most importantly, I knew they were confident enough in their psychological manipulation that they probably weren't expecting me to try anything desperate. I spent the morning preparing for what would either be a rescue operation or a suicide mission. I loaded the Winchester with my best ammunition, filled a backpack with medical supplies and emergency gear, and studied the topographic maps one more time to identify possible escape routes if everything went wrong. Around noon, I heard vehicles approaching on the access road that led to my cabin. For a moment, I hoped the sheriff's department had finally taken my report seriously and was arriving to provide backup for a rescue attempt. But when I looked out the window, I saw 2 pickup trucks I didn't recognize and several men in hunting gear walking toward my front door. They moved with the kind of casual confidence that suggested they were armed and expected no resistance. The knock on my door was polite but firm. When I opened it, I found myself facing a man in his 50s, with gray hair and the kind of weathered features that come from spending most of your life outdoors. "Marcus, I'm Jim Crawford. This is my son Billy and my brother Pete. We understand you've been having some trouble with unusual wildlife in the area." I stared at him, trying to process what I was hearing. "How did you know about—" "Word gets around in small mountain communities. Sheriff Coleman mentioned your reports to a friend of mine, and that friend called me. We've dealt with this kind of problem before." "What kind of problem?" Jim Crawford smiled, but there was no humor in his expression. "The kind that regular law enforcement isn't equipped to handle. The kind that's been living in these mountains a lot longer than most people realize." He gestured toward his companions, and I noticed they were carrying rifles with modifications I didn't recognize, specialized scopes, unusual ammunition, gear that looked like it had been designed for a very specific type of hunting. "Mind if we come in? We've got some things to discuss before tonight." I let them into the cabin, still trying to understand how they'd found me or what they thought they knew about my situation. Jim Crawford's group looked like experienced hunters, but they carried themselves with the kind of tactical awareness that suggested military or law enforcement backgrounds. "How much do you know about what's been happening here?" I asked. "We know your family was taken 3 nights ago by a pack of what most people would call werewolves, though that's not technically accurate." We know they've offered to trade your family's lives for your participation in some kind of transformation ritual. And we know that tonight's full moon is when they expect you to make your final decision." My hands started shaking again. How could you possibly know all that? Billy Crawford, who looked to be in his 30s with the same weathered features as his father, answered from where he was examining my ammunition supplies. "Because we've been tracking this particular pack for over 2 years. They've taken other families, made similar offers to other men. Most of those men didn't survive the experience." "You're saying this has happened before?" 17 times that we know of across Montana, Idaho, and Alberta, Pete Crawford said. He was older than his brother, with grey stubble and scars on his hands that looked like they'd come from fighting. "These creatures have been expanding their territory and their numbers by forcibly recruiting human males to serve as pack leaders." Jim Crawford spread a map on my kitchen table, marking locations with red X's. The pattern showed a clear progression across the northern Rocky Mountains, with incidents clustered around areas of old-growth forest and minimal human population. The process works like this. They identify an isolated male with outdoor skills and no close family ties. They establish territory around his property and begin psychological harassment designed to break down his resistance. Then they take his family or loved ones and offer a trade, his voluntary participation in their transformation ritual in exchange for their release. What happens to the families? If the man agrees and survives the transformation, the family is released unharmed. If he refuses or dies during the ritual, the family disappears permanently. Billy looked up from examining my rifle. "The success rate for the transformation is about 30%. Most men don't survive the process, and those who do are changed in ways that go beyond the physical." I felt sick. "You're telling me these creatures have been kidnapping families and forcing men to become monsters for years, and nobody's tried to stop them?" "We've tried," Pete said quietly. "Lost. 3 good men in the process. These aren't ordinary predators, Marcus. They're intelligent, organized, and they learn from every encounter. Each time we've engaged them, they've adapted their tactics and become harder to track." "So what are you doing here?" Jim Crawford folded the map and looked at me with an expression that was part sympathy and part calculation. "We're offering you an alternative to surrender. Help us locate their current settlement, and we'll mount a rescue operation for your family. It's dangerous, probably suicidal, but it's better than giving them what they want." "Which is what exactly?" "A new alpha who's smart enough to help them expand their territory into more populated areas. They've been limited to remote wilderness regions because they need isolated targets and minimal law enforcement response. But with human intelligence guiding their strategy, they could start operating in suburban areas, small towns, places with much larger populations to recruit from." The scope of what they were describing was terrifying. This wasn't just about my family or even my own survival. The creatures were trying to evolve their hunting strategies, and my recruitment would represent a significant escalation in their threat to human communities. "What makes you think I can help you find them?" "Because they've been watching you, which means you've been watching them. You know their movement patterns, their communication methods, their behavioral characteristics. Combined with our tracking experience and firepower, that might be enough to pull off a rescue." Billy Crawford chambered around in his rifle and checked his scope settings. "Course, there's a good chance we'll all be dead by morning, but at least your family will have a fighting chance." I looked at these 3 men who'd appeared out of nowhere, with knowledge that should have been impossible and equipment. That suggested they'd been preparing for this kind of operation for years. They were offering me hope, but it was hope wrapped in what sounded like a suicide mission. Outside, the sun was beginning to set, and the creatures would be expecting my answer soon. "All right," I said, "let's go get my family back." The rescue operation began at sunset, with Jim Crawford's team moving through the forest like they'd been hunting these creatures their entire lives. Their equipment was more sophisticated than I'd initially realized. Night vision scopes, thermal imaging devices, communications gear that allowed silent coordination across distances, and ammunition that had been modified in ways they didn't explain. "Silver?" I asked Billy Crawford as we made our way toward the area where I'd last detected signs of pack activity. "Among other things. Took us a while to figure out what actually works on them." Turns out the old folklore got some things right and some things completely wrong. We were following a tracking strategy that combined my knowledge of the creature's behavioral patterns with their experience in pack-hunting tactics. The plan was simple in concept, but terrifyingly complex in execution. Locate the settlement, create enough chaos to overwhelm their defenses, extract my family and escape before the full moon reached its peak, and whatever transformation ritual they had planned could take place. The reality was that we were 4 men with rifles going up against an unknown number of creatures with supernatural abilities, home field advantage, and nothing to lose. After about 2 hours of careful movement through increasingly dense forest, Pete Crawford signaled that his thermal imaging equipment was picking up heat signatures ahead. Multiple large forms moving in coordinated patterns around what appeared to be a natural depression in the landscape. "That's them," Jim whispered into his throat mic. "Same heat signature profile we've seen before. Marcus, how many would you estimate?" I studied the thermal display, trying to match the electronic images with what I'd observed during my scouting of the original settlement. At least 20 adults, maybe more. If they brought their young, we could be looking at 30 or 40 individuals. "Jesus," Billy muttered. "That's twice the size of the largest pack we've encountered." "They're consolidating," Jim said grimly, "bringing together multiple family groups for something big. The recruitment ritual tonight isn't just about replacing their alpha, it's about preparing for a major territorial expansion." We positioned ourselves around the perimeter of the depression, using natural cover and elevation advantages to establish overlapping fields of fire. The creatures had chosen their new settlement well. It was defensible, hidden, and offered multiple escape routes if they needed to relocate again. But they'd made one critical mistake. They were so confident in their psychological manipulation of me that they'd focused all their security on preventing escape from within the settlement rather than defending against external attack. Through my scope, I could see the structures they'd built in just a few days. Crude but functional shelters arranged around a central area that had been cleared of vegetation and marked with the same symbolic carvings I'd found on trees throughout the region. And in the center of that cleared area, 3 figures that made my heart stop. My family, alive but bound with ropes and positioned around what looked like an altar made of stacked stones. They appeared to be unconscious or drugged, their heads hanging forward and their bodies slack against their restraints. The creatures moved around them in patterns that suggested ritual preparation. Some were adding wood to fires that surrounded the central clearing. Others were arranging objects, bones, carved stones, items I couldn't identify from this distance, in precise geometric patterns around the altar. "They're getting ready for the ceremony," Jim whispered. "Once that moon reaches its peak, they'll start the transformation process, whether you're here to volunteer or not." "What do you mean?" "If you don't show up willingly, they'll force the issue. Use your family's lives to coerce your participation. The ritual requires voluntary submission from the subject, but their definition of voluntary is pretty flexible." I watched through my scope as one of the creatures approached my father with what looked like a crude knife, not threatening, just positioning the weapon where it would be visible when consciousness returned. That decided it for me. "We go in now." The attack began with coordinated sniper fire from 4 positions simultaneously. Jim Crawford's modified ammunition proved devastatingly effective. The creatures didn't just fall when shot, they stayed down, whatever supernatural resilience they possessed, apparently overcome by his specialized rounds. But the pack adapted quickly to the threat. Instead of panicking or scattering, they moved into defensive formations that suggested military-level tactical training. Some took cover and attempted to locate our positions. Others moved to protect the ritual site and the captives. A third group melted into the forest around us, obviously planning to attack from behind. "They're flanking us," Pete called over the radio. "Multiple hostiles moving to our 6. The battle became a running firefight through the forest, with human technology and planning matched against supernatural abilities and intimate knowledge of the terrain. We had the advantage of range and firepower, but they had numbers, coordination, and physical capabilities that defied normal biology. I fought my way toward the central clearing where my family was held, Billy Crawford covering my advance while his father and uncle kept the main pack occupied. The creatures guarding the altar were the largest I'd seen, massive, powerful specimens that moved with deadly grace and showed no fear of our weapons. The first one reached me before I could chamber another round, moving with speed that seemed to bend physics. Its claws tore through my jacket and left parallel wounds across my chest, but I managed to get the rifle barrel between us and fire at point-blank range. The creature staggered backward, dark blood spreading across its fur-covered chest, but it didn't fall. Instead, it opened its mouth and spoke in that disturbing hybrid voice. "You cannot stop. This pack grows, or pack dies." "Then I guess the pack dies," I said, and put a second round through its skull. By the time I reached my family, Jim Crawford's team had eliminated or driven off most of the pack defenders. My parents and Emma were unconscious but breathing, drugged with something that left them limp, but apparently uninjured. "We need to move," Billy shouted from the perimeter. "More heat signatures approaching from the north. Reinforcements." I cut, the ropes holding my family while Jim Crawford placed explosive charges around the ritual site. Whatever ceremony these creatures had planned, we were going to make sure it could never happen here again. "Can you carry your sister?" Pete asked, helping me lift Emma's unconscious form. "I've got her. Just get us out of here." The extraction was a nightmare of careful movement through darkness, while carrying unconscious people and expecting attack from any direction. But Jim Crawford's team had planned multiple escape routes, and their knowledge of the creature's hunting patterns allowed us to avoid the reinforcements that were converging on the settlement. We reached the vehicles just as the explosions lit up the forest behind us. The ritual site was gone, the settlement was destroyed, and the pack's territorial claim on this area was effectively ended. But as we drove away with my family safe in the back of the trucks, I knew this wasn't over. The creatures had been expanding their range for years, recruiting human intelligence to enhance their capabilities. One destroyed settlement wouldn't end that threat. "Where do we go from here?" I asked Jim Crawford as we reached the main highway. "Your family gets medical attention and protection while they recover. You come with us and help track down the rest of the packs before they adapt to what happened tonight." I looked back at my unconscious parents and sister, thinking about the nightmare they'd endured because of my encounter with something that shouldn't exist. They deserved to wake up in a world where they never had to face this kind of threat again. How many more are out there? Too many. And they learn from every encounter, every failure, every success. Tonight we won a battle, but the war is just beginning. Through the truck's rear window, I could see fires still burning in the distant forest where the settlement had been. But I could also see shapes moving through the trees, survivors regrouping, planning their next move. I'd killed their alpha, rescued my family, and destroyed their base of operations. But in doing so, I'd also learned the truth that would haunt the rest of my life. I'd seen werewolves. I'd fought werewolves. And now the werewolves knew that humans could fight back. The pack would adapt, evolve, return stronger and smarter than before, and they'd remember my face. Thank you for experiencing the Howling Shadows. If this terrifying werewolf encounter left you wanting more supernatural horror stories, please subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss a spine-chilling tale. Leave a like if this story gave you goosebumps, and let us know in the comments what city or country you're watching from. We love connecting with horror fans from around the world. Most importantly, share in the comments if you've ever heard werewolf legends or encountered strange creatures in your region. Every culture has stories of shapeshifters and forest dwellers that exist between human and animal. Your local folklore might hold clues about threats that are more real than anyone wants to admit. What would you do if you encountered creatures like the ones in Marcus's story? Would you try to negotiate, fight back, or run? Let us know your survival strategy, and remember, in the deep woods you're never truly alone. Something is always watching from the shadows. Subscribe, like, and stay safe out there. The pack is always hunting,